Hi, welcome to this video on technical memoranda. Uh, Memoranda, or memos, are a very common format for written communication in a variety of professional contexts. They can be used um, for various sorts of reports or proposals or announcements, and among various other types of contents. Um, they are also particularly well suited for um, describing content of a technical nature because their general structure and typical elements are a nice fit for some of the concerns that we talked about previously about needing to make sure that our communicative deliverables are crafted in a way that allows different audiences with different backgrounds, different areas of expertise, different reasons for reading to get what they need to get out of our document. So I think I'd like to segue from that into a case study. So we're going to look at a case study of particular historical significance, the famous 3 Mile Island nuclear incident. And you'll see where I'm going with this in a moment. First, let me give a brief bit of context. The 3 Mile Island nuclear incident, TMI for short, the incident at TMI never actually had to happen. It's likely that it could have been prevented. Turns out that about a year and a half prior to that uh, incident, a similar type of issue occurred at a nuclear power plant in Toledo, run by the same company with similar technical issues, similar employee training, and so when an engineering manager, after running an investigation uh, at Toledo, realized that this type of thing could happen again at other plants run by the same company, he wrote a memorandum and sent it to executives at this company, warning that, hey, we have other power plants, they could suffer from the same type of issue. And even though we were lucky, and when it happened in Toledo, it didn't become catastrophic, it's quite possible that if this happens again, they won't be so lucky, and the results could be catastrophic. And it turns out that's what happened. About a year and a half later, the TMI incident happened. And in between those two incidents, this memorandum never got acted upon. And the big question is, why not? And before we delve into that aspect of it, let's back up a moment and just look at some context on the technical side for what actually happened. Now, this is just a proverbial 30,000 feet view. I'm just going to go over the highlights so you have a general sense of what actually happened. Uh, there was a valve that stuck open, which allowed coolant to leak out. This caused a pressure drop near the reactor core, which triggered the emergency coolant system. This restored the pressure, and when employees saw that the pressure was restored, they figured the emergency coolant system did its job, and they shut it off, not realizing that we had this valve that was stuck open, which caused the problem in the first place and would continue to cause that problem. So we had a mechanical issue, but perhaps more importantly, we had a training issue for the operators. Okay, so with that, I have these three slides here, and um, across the three of them is the entire contents of this brief memo. So it's not that the memo is too long. It was relatively brief as far as memos go. Uh, but let's take a look at it. And as you go through it, what I'll do is I'll put it in full screen mode here, and you I'll go through each. You can pause on each one to read through it, and as you read, think about why you think busy managerial readers may not have acted upon what they were reading here. Okay, so if you missed anything, you can go back and pause as you like. So as you can see, I'll just go over a couple things here. If we go back to the beginning, we start out with an abbreviation there, ECCS. Well, at, before we even get to the end of that sentence, we have another abbreviation, LOCA. Okay, so ECCS and LOCA. We do have a third one down here that is spelled out, so that's good. They give us the words here for this one. But these first two in the first sentence, we don't. Even just knowing what these stand for could be quite helpful, right? So ECCS stands for Emergency Coolant Control System, and LOCA, or LOCA, stands for Loss of Coolant Accident. So knowing either or both of those in the first sentence could have been helpful in getting attention from non-technical or quasi-technical or technical adjacent audiences who are more on the business side of things and need to have things worded in a way that is accessible to them. So, there's no shortage of issues that we could go at here, so I'm just going to kind of survey a couple other ones. A big one, though, is that we get to the end of the second paragraph here before we actually get to any kind of statement of the problem, right? The core of the problem, no pun intended, that we could have had core uncovery and associated damage. Now let's turn to how we may have rewritten this. And specifically, let's turn to how we might select certain key information and arrange it in a sequence that makes sense for the widest range of readers, and then phrasing it in a way that is accessible to the widest range of readers. So all of those things we want to keep in mind as we write the first paragraph of a memo. Because remember that a lot of busy managerial members of our audience may not get much past the first paragraph if the first paragraph doesn't convey both the importance and enough specificity about the nature of the importance that it's credible and actionable. So here's a possible rewrite for the first paragraph. Pause for a moment, read it, and think about why this is better than what we had before. Okay, so there are several reasons why this is an improvement. Tying it back to the last comment that I made about how long it takes to get to the problem being buried at the end of the second paragraph, by contrast, here we get to it right away, right? The first couple sentences give us the problem. All right. Following a loss of coolant accident. Now, by the way, uh, although I say here that we use less jargon, it doesn't necessarily mean no jargon. So we might make the decision that this is one acronym we do want to keep, but we at least spell it out right away, right? So, following a loss of coolant accident, operators are instructed to turn off the emergency recovery system once the core pressure has returned to normal. However, twice at the Toledo plant, operators have prematurely shut off emergency coolant flow. In a fully functional plant, this would likely have resulted in core uncovery and associated damage. Right? See how uh, this gives enough specificity about the nature of the problem to be credible, to be on its way towards being actionable, and yet is accessible to a wide range of readers, whether or not they have any significant level of technical knowledge about the particular uh, nature of the valve or the pressures involved that led to the shutoff, or the exact training, um, the details about the training or anything like that, right? So we have the right level of abstraction here. Um, and it's very clear from the beginning why the writer is writing. You can tell that even just from the first part of this first paragraph. So notice what comes after the part that gives us the problem. We have what the writer is doing about it or has done about it. So this is the writer's task. The, the first part of this paragraph is the organizational or institutional problem. This middle part is the writer's task, whether it's a task they gave themselves, if they have sufficient authority to do so, or a task that they did jointly with others that they took the lead on, or whether it's a task they were assigned. So if this were more of a subordinate employee, they might say, "You assigned me the task of doing that." But in this case, it's written by an engineering manager who just speaks on behalf of his team, saying, as a result of these incidents, we investigated the cause of the Toledo incidents to determine how best to avoid this situation in the future. Okay, simple, a bit abstract, but it does the job. Okay, so then the last part of this paragraph is to describe the communicative purpose. All right. So the communicative purpose, and oftentimes a good way to signal that you're transitioning to this part of this paragraph, is to literally say the purpose of this memo is. There's nothing wrong with that. So we end this paragraph by saying the purpose of this memo is to present the results of our investigation and to propose changing the current operator instructions to reflect a better understanding of the conditions under which they should terminate the emergency coolant flow. So we have two parts to this, right? One, to present the results, of our investigation, and secondly, to propose changing the current operator instructions. Um, so we have the problem that we're responding to, the task, which is how we responded to that problem, and then the communicative purpose, which is what's the reason for this document? What does this document have to do with this task that I just did in response to this problem that I just told you about? So a lot of times we use the initials PTP for this type of paragraph, problem, task, purpose, to remember that that's the right sequence to start a memo with. And your first paragraph is often called the forward paragraph, or sometimes the PTP paragraph, because the forward takes that sequence. And each of those elements of the forward are usually 1 to 2 sentences on average, depending on the situation. Notice that what the forward doesn't do is it doesn't actually give these results or the proposed recommendations, right? So The proposed changes and the results will come in the summary, which starts in the next paragraph. But the foreword doesn't actually begin yet to fulfill that communicative purpose. It just sets the stage for it. Um, so that's an important distinction, and that's part of the convention of a memorandum that readers are used to looking for. So it's important to try to follow that convention so they know, okay, this first paragraph is where I find out what the problem is, what you did about it, and what the point of the document is. And then the second paragraph is where I start to get whatever it is you told me is the point of the document. All right, so uh, make sure to not get ahead of yourself in the foreword. All right, so looking a little bit more at this partial rewrite, this basically just takes the same text and kind of breaks it down into stages just to kind of uh, help analyze the different elements of the foreword or the PTP paragraph. So if you look at 1 and 2 together, they jointly serve as what's often known as the problem statement. That first main element of the foreword where you're telling what the problem is. And the reason why this is broken into two steps here, and so there's 4 steps overall, even though there's really 3 main parts of the foreword, is because usually the problem statement is in what's called A but B format, where A is the current state and the but B is why there's a problem with the current state. And so 1 and 2 together are typically how you have the problem statement. Now, that's not the only format for a problem statement. It's just the most common, so it's how I framed it here. Then, after the problem statement, we have the task statement, which is that task element that we talked about before. In this case, it's just a very simple sentence. Oftentimes, a task statement will at least give some generalized reference to key criteria or constraints involving the task, but oftentimes those are more appropriately preserved for the main body of the memorandum. So that's a judgment call based on each situation. In this case, I went with a fairly generic task statement. The purpose statement is, and I should always, some people just call it the purpose statement. I try to call it the communicative purpose statement because sometimes when you just say purpose, your brain starts thinking the purpose of my task or the purpose of the work that I did. But in a memorandum, when we're talking about the foreword, it's the communicative purpose. It's the purpose of the document, not the purpose of your task. So I think just calling it the communicative purpose is a helpful way to remember that. All right, so that's the foreword. That's a lot of emphasis just for the very first paragraph of the memorandum, but it's the most important paragraph because even if the rest of the memo in that case study we just looked at had remained as dense, as disorganized, as non-reader oriented, as I'm sure you noticed that it was, if only it had had a good foreword, a good first paragraph, there's a really good chance it would have gotten the attention that it needed to at least inspire the necessary follow-ups to slog through the rest of it and figure out what needed to be done. All right, so after the foreword, which for our purposes we're going to limit to just 1 paragraph to keep it, which is most common anyway. So the summary will start with the second paragraph. Now, summaries have a bit more flexibility. They're not quite as rigid in the sense that, first sentence or two has to be this, the next sentence or two has to be this. Summaries are a little more flexible, both in terms of how many paragraphs they are. I'd say 1 to 3 paragraphs for a memorandum summary is pretty typical, depending on the size of the paragraphs and the arrangement of the information within them. But you have discretion over the arrangement as well as the size. So it's in a sense looser than a forward is, but there are still certain jobs that a summary needs to do. So I'll be providing examples for both forwards and summaries, separately. But the key things to keep in mind for a summary are that it begins to actually fulfill the communicative purpose. And for a subset of your readers, it will be the full fulfillment of your communicative purpose, right? So you have to make sure that it actually contains a condensed, concise, yet sufficiently complete, so there's a balancing act, version of the main body of your memorandum. So as part of this, you need to consider what are the most relevant findings and conclusions. So prioritize what matters the most to include, and then for everything else, you're either abstracting it, phrasing things in a more general way so that it can be more, so that you can use fewer sentences to capture more content at the expense of detail that will be provided in the discussion portion of the memo. Or in some cases, simply omitting certain facts and not even reflecting it indirectly through more abstract statements. So that's a case by case judgment, depending on each item of information that you have to think through what makes the most sense for your situation. Usually, a memorandum includes a recommendation, one or more recommendations. If there are more than one and they're all pretty highly related, generally they come at the end of the summary. So that's probably the most common approach. So I'll just leave it at that. But as I mentioned, there is flexibility to consider other approaches if you think that makes more sense in your situation. Regarding labeling, so we have the forward and the summary. Together, these are jointly known as the memo's overview. Now, sometimes you label the forward and then you label the summary. Sometimes you don't label the forward and then you label the summary because it's obvious that if the forward is the very first paragraph and then the summary is labeled, it's very clear where the forward begins and ends. So some people just don't label that individually by itself. And there's some other approaches as well. But those, for our purposes, we'll use those two main approaches. You can choose from either. In neither case, though, do we actually label the overview, because that would be redundant since the forward and the summary together are known as the overview. But when we refer to it, that's what we're referring to, is that combo of the forward and summary. Okay. So we also can't forget about the header. Now, I didn't include the header for the TMI memo, but there were some significant things there as well. And for example, it was actually to the head of licensing, and then the more relevant recipients were actually in the distribution list. And you have to keep in mind that when you put somebody in the distribution list or the CC list, you're sending a message. That's key information. You're telling them that they are not primary. It is not that important if they read it. So you could have multiple people in the to line, but sometimes, just like with email, which borrows the header structure from memoranda, sometimes people will just be like, oh, it doesn't matter whether I put people in the to line or the CC line. Well, that's not true in email, and it's not true in memos. It matters because you are sending a message about whether they are a primary or a peripheral audience. Um, the other things to keep in mind are that the date should be internationally friendly. So you should at least abbreviate the name of the month just to be safe. Whether you do the number before the abbreviation of the month or abbreviation of the month and then the number for the day. There are different conventions. There, unless you have a style guide that stipulates one or the other, the key thing is just to make sure that you're not having it be all numbers. Because of different conventions in different countries. I sometimes when I'm using automated forms that force me to use only numbers on certain websites, I actually try to only do it after the 12th of the month, so that I don't risk looking at it later at some point and getting confused. But when you're actually typing your memo, you can just choose to at least either spell out the month or spell out the abbreviation for the month. Subject lines. This is often not given nearly the amount of thought that it really deserves. There's another balancing act here. I know I talked about summaries being a balancing act of concise yet informative. Subject lines are kind of like that too. We want them to be informative but concise, although the level of concision is much greater, so the ratio is different. But there's a similar balancing act that we have to have here. And it's very unhelpful to just have the subject line be something like progress report, research report, proposal. But novice uh, technical communicators often do just default to that because uh, they're not really focused on that part, right? You're focused on the main body, but the subject line, for some readers, the subject line might be where they make their decision about whether to keep reading or not. So it's very important to make sure that you uh, make a good effort to really find a good balance of how to be informative while being concise on that. Um, There are some elements of a header that don't always exist. Again, kind of parallel to email, right? You don't always attach something on an email. You don't always have attachments for a memorandum. You don't always have a CC on an email. You don't always have a distribution list on a memorandum, but you could, and so I put them there just to keep that in mind. Some people consider the header itself as part of the overview because of some of the things we were just talking about, how it can be it can be very significant, the sorts of information that it conveys. I mean, the subject line, of course, but even just choosing to signal to somebody whether they're in the primary audience or the peripheral audience. Um, so, because of the significant information that it conveys, some people will actually consider that to be part of the overview. It doesn't really matter whether you call it that or not, but the more important thing is to appreciate why some people do consider it that, and it's because of its importance. I also just want to point out that the subject line, the purpose statement, the communicative purpose statement, and the summary, all three of those things should work together, right? So the subject line kind of gives broad strokes about the subject matter, the topic, what the document is about. The communicative purpose narrows that a bit, tells me more specifically what's this document going to specifically contain regarding that broader subject, and then the summary actually starts to fulfill that communicative purpose. So those three things, subject line, communicative purpose, and summary, should really work in concert uh, for for all audiences, really. So the overview part is what we've been talking about so far, right? Header, forward, summary, and all three of those collectively, you should, in for most typical length memos, you're shooting for around 1 page total for those three things. Maybe the summary will spill a little bit onto the second page. Maybe sometimes it won't fully take up the whole first page and you'll start the discussion at the bottom of the first page. But on average, for a typical length memorandum, we're usually looking at about the first page for the entire overview. So what about the rest of it? I've, you know, I'm 3/4 of the way through my slides and we haven't, gotten to the rest of it yet, right? Well, that should tell you something about how much proportional effort it actually takes to get that front matter right, right? So if you look at this pyramid metaphor here, you got that overview portion, that top part. You got the more detailed discussion, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then at the bottom, as more the foundational layer, you have what, for our purposes, will either be a references page and or attachments. These are things that go beyond even the discussion portion of the memo, which is the main body that we'll be talking about in a moment, to things that not even all the technical experts who have the same background you do will necessarily read, but they're available for reference. So you have a reference list if somebody wants to go back and look at some other report or some article or some book chapter that you're referring to. And you also may have attachments with other materials of any sort that you may draw upon or refer to in your discussion, or just be providing because it may be of relevant interest to some subset of your audience. All right, so let's look at the entire memorandum structure now. So that first part we talked about, memo header, forward, and summary. Then, and this is not proportional by length because that whole first part, top grouping there, is all approximately 1 page, even if your entire memo is several pages. So the discussion part of the memo, for typical length, will usually begin with a brief introduction and end with a conclusion. And I can hear what you're thinking. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. We just wrote something called a forward and something called a summary. And now I'm supposed to write something called an introduction and something called a conclusion? That's like 4 things that are going to have, like, there's got to be some overlap in there. And we still haven't even gotten to the nitty-gritty details, right? Yeah, well, a couple reasons for this. Number one, remember the audiences issue that we talked about. Well, just like you're going to have some audiences who only read that approximate first page, the header, forward, and summary, if that, we also want it to be modular in a sense that an expert audience, somebody who was going to read the entire discussion, could, in theory, skip the forward and summary and still have it make sense. So I'm not saying they would necessarily do that, but maybe they'll skim the forward and summary, maybe they'll read the whole thing. But in theory, it should be modular in the sense that somebody could skip the forward and summary. Secondly, it is a bit different. So while there's definitely a lot of overlap, so for example, the introduction overlaps a lot with the forward. In addition to having the problem, task, and purpose, though, although somewhat rephrased, of course, it's typical to include a bit more background information, particularly on the associated with your problem statement. It's also typical, although not universal, to end the introduction with some sort of forecast of what how the rest of the discussion section is going to go. So maybe a few sentences walking the reader through the various sections and subsections that will follow. Again, that's not always the case, but that's something that sometimes differentiates an introduction from a forward, say. But if you want to boil it down to a simple, like, what's the core overlap here? Where's the bulk of the redundancy? Introduction overlaps pretty heavily with a forward. Again, rephrased and certain things elaborated upon, and maybe some things added, but by and large, introduction parallels the forward. And by and large, the conclusion at the end of your discussion portion parallels the summary. Um, Again, rephrased, maybe different emphases. Maybe you can, in a conclusion, get a little more concrete about certain things because that's meant for somebody who's actually read the whole discussion, or at least read enough of it that you can expect them to appreciate certain more concrete details that maybe you couldn't put in the summary. So there's those nuanced differences. Another additional thing that will sometimes be in a conclusion that wasn't in a summary is it may end with some forward-looking statements, things about next steps, future work, things like that. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a feel for some of this modularity and the nuanced distinctions there. But what about the actual core detail itself that we kept kind of talking around all this time? Well, that is in between the introduction and conclusion. So you should generally have multiple sections. The the heading hierarchy should be the same for the introduction and your top level section headings and your conclusion. So those should all be the same, and those should also be the same as your forward and summary headings, assuming you labeled both of those. So those should all be top level headings. And then within your main body sections, you may have some subsections in some of those. So that's fine too. There is an exception to all of this, and that's if you're dealing with a very brief memorandum. In that case, you'll still have the overview like we talked about, but then you'll just have a big section labeled discussion. Okay? It's only even an option if the entire discussion is less than a couple pages. You still could very well choose to have sections, but if the discussion section is at least 2 pages, then I would say it's not even an option. You have to have an introduction and a conclusion and sections in between. So hopefully that gives you a feel for the norms on that. You For that lower level of the pyramid, you may have some sort of reference material. This could be attachments, it could be a reference list, but sometimes that's referred to as the documentation aspect of the memorandum. But that all deals with that lower level of the pyramid, things that you're not really expecting any portion of your audience to fully read. You're just providing it as a resource if and when certain members of your audience find it helpful to consult as they go. All right. Visuals should often be incorporated into a memorandum whenever it would be helpful to do so. You can divide the world of visuals for most technical documents into two. There's tables and figures. And a figure is anything that's not a table. So if it's a photograph, if it's a scatter plot, if it's a bar chart, uh, if it's a diagram, whatever the case may be, it's a figure. And this comes into play for numbering purposes because uh, if you have a table, that's table one, then you have a photograph, say, that's figure one, then you have a scatter plot, that's figure two, then you have a table, that's table two, right? So you just have to kind of keep those two universes separate, and then you just got to count in sequence as you go based on that system. Unless specifically specified in a style guide or some such, you have a lot of discretion on the specifics of how you integrate it. So, in terms of whether to use wraparound text or just have white space on either side, or whether to bundle by highly related items. So, if you're showing two extremely related figures, would you maybe call them 1A and 1B as opposed to 1 and 2? Um, things like that are very usually discretionary. Uh, this slide shows here, I'm going to expand this one for a moment. Um, this shows how to handle incorporating and integrating visuals in a useful way. So let me just get it all on the screen there. Okay, so we have certain aspects of good integration of a visual. One is what's called the text reference, and this is the part of the text that refers to the forthcoming visual immediately before showing it. And so whether it's literally the very preceding sentence or a little bit before that with a slight explanation in between, there's some gray area there, but very shortly preceding the visual, there should be an introduction of it. Then there should be callouts, like arrows coming in from the side with labels, like you see there, aluminum blades, for example, uh, and also a title and caption, like you see at the bottom there, figure 3 with a descriptive caption. Then in the prose that follows the caption, you have what's called the verbal walkthrough, where you provide whatever further explanation may be helpful in making sure the reader understands what they're supposed to take away from this. Sometimes it seems really obvious to the person who put the visual together what a reader is supposed to get out of it, but sometimes they need to be walked through it so they understand what they're supposed to take away from it. And then they go back up and look at it again, and it makes a lot more sense. So that's the basic approach: is introduce it, show it, and explain it. And hopefully this slide here helps you get a sense of the basics of that. Now, again, a lot of the specifics other than these sort of general principles are up to you. So are you going to, how exactly you format the call outs, whether you use arrows or lines, management of white space, other things like that. There's a lot of discretion, but these are some pretty general principles. All right. And I just want to close by highlighting some differences between memos and other types of communication that we may utilize. So these kind of fall in between emails and more formal documents, such as a formal report. Now, formal documents, they're sometimes highly prescriptive in terms of what the audience wants, in terms of exact sections and exactly what sorts of appendices they should have and all that, depending on the situation. But even when they're open-ended, much like a memo is, there still is a lot more to it than a memo, right? You have a cover page, you have a table of contents, things that a memo doesn't have, and that are a little bit more work to put together than a standard memo header, right? So The memo kind of fits in between emails, which are a step lower on formality, and what we can call formal documents, like I was just referring to, which are a step higher. And they are useful for a wide range of content genres. As I've mentioned before, usually it's reports of some sort um, that are at a level of formality and or length that seems to fit the norm for a memo. They work for they oftentimes proposals, announcements, and other content genres as well as reports. But reports span such a wide range that there are so many kinds of reports that that tends to be what memos in effect are. Uh, the As I mentioned, email borrows its header style from the memorandum because the memorandum came first. But sometimes the email, although sort of like a mini memo, because it doesn't really allow as well for multiple sections and the overview and things you can do with a little bit more length, as well as the convention of being having people know where to look for which types of information. So sometimes memos are desirable for having those things to offer their audience. And as so many things need to be documented in many areas of engineering development, whether on paper or as PDF files, memorandums are often more suitable for that kind of archival. So uh, that's all I have for this lesson. So this has been an overview of memoranda, including most notably their overview portion, as well as the other sections of them as well. So thanks for watching. Take care.